Alright, so around this time of year for HSR, there's generally quite a lot to be excited for. Usually this is when the quote-unquote heavy hitters of each patch cycle first make their major appearance in the story, and we also get their subsequent banners like we're currently seeing with the upcoming Silverwolf 999 and Evanescea 2. Alongside that though, around this time of year is when the anniversary is on the horizon, and with it, a whole bunch of events and rewards like free pulls, a standard character selector, top-up resets for the whales out there, and I think some triple rewards from relic domains or something, so EA for that I guess. But more importantly than that stuff though, there's one last thing that everyone is expecting from the anniversary, and that's the golden selector for the Stellar Convergence shop. Seeing as so far they've given out 2 for free, once when they introduced it at the 3.2 anniversary, but also another when they added Topaz to the shop, it's pretty safe to say that we'll be getting another one with the upcoming anniversary in 4.2. So today, what I wanted to do was go through each of the characters in that shop, talk about what they do and their value in the current state of the game, some potential future characters being added to it, and most importantly, a rating for each that might give you an idea of who you should pick from it. So let's get started. So, for those of you unfamiliar, currently the Stellar Convergence shop has 10 different characters in it. There's the default 7 characters which are Yanqing, Gepard, Bronya, Welt, Himeko, Clara, and Bailu, but there's also currently 3 limited characters which are Ruan Mei, Luocha, and Topaz. There's also some speculative characters that might be added to the shop soon, but we'll get into them closer to the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. Now, normally when you look at a lineup like that, you'd pretty much immediately discount the standard characters. I mean, let's be real here, in a game like HSR with rampant power creep and whatnot, it's pretty easy to understand why these kinds of characters aren't as valuable at face value compared to any of the limited ones. I mean, we're at HSR's 3rd anniversary, which means it's been 3 years since the standard characters are released, and that also means those characters have had 3 years worth of time to fall off a cliff in terms of meta relevance. As a result, this would normally mean that there's really only 3 different characters to choose from, being the 3 limited ones, but thanks to one specific guide that's getting a buff in 4.2, we now know that even standard characters can get some stuff too, and that inherently makes them all worth talking about, even if it's more speculative. I mean, I can't lie, it even gives me a tiny bit of hope that maybe one day we'll even see a 4-star get a buff.
Right?
Really though, before starting this, I do want to mention that at the end of the day, only you know what you need. You should be using this video as a reference to give you an idea or push yourself in the right direction, not as the end-all be-all. If you like Himeko, get Himeko. If Gepard is your GOAT, go get him instead. But anyway, I think what I'm going to do is just go through each of the units alphabetically, so let's start with Bailu. Believe it or not, in my opinion, Bailu is actually a really interesting character. For those of you unfamiliar, and I don't blame you if you are, she's a healer, but her healing is actually pretty unique. For one, if you try healing with her skill, it bounces 3 times, once to the main target and then twice completely randomly. So, in the event where you really need to heal just one unit a lot, there really isn't a guarantee that you actually heal that specific character. Alongside that, it doesn't have any debuff cleanses either, and while that's not a huge deal anymore due to a lot of newer releases having some form of a cleanse, it is still a little bit of a detriment to her kit as a whole. With that said, frankly, her skill definitely isn't great, but her ult is more or less a saving grace of her kit. See, her ult is where that interesting part of her kit comes from, because not only does it heal, it also applies something called Invigoration to the team, which is instant on-demand healing after allies get hit. So, for example, let's say Bailu's Invigoration heals 500 HP and you take 500 damage, effectively what happens is you don't take any damage at all. And on paper, to me, that is really interesting because, like I said, it's on demand. You don't have to spend SP or wait a full turn for your healer to get an action, because it just happens on its own whenever they get hit. But despite that though, unfortunately for Bailu, 500 heals in the current day and age really isn't a whole lot, so while the mechanic itself is actually pretty good, it just really doesn't do enough anymore. If you add on that she has the really scuffed bounce skill, and also the fact that at least currently her eidolons aren't really anything special either, I can't really recommend her as someone that you should pick with your future golden selector at both the base and eidolon copy. And as such, I have to put her down at a D tier for pickability. She is okay for new accounts, but definitely not any kind of older one. That said, just like how Welt is getting a buff, Bailu could at some point too. While I definitely don't expect that potential buff to somehow make her competitive with the broken sustain units like Dan Hang or Hyacine for example, especially so because she has no damage in her kit, I do actually see a world where if they play off the one actually unique mechanic in her kit, then she would be at least a little bit useful for accounts that don't have one or both of those aforementioned characters. So if I had something like a most likely to be buffed tier list to describe the potential future value, I'd actually probably place her around a B. Next, we can move on to Bronya, and Bronya as well, honestly, she's actually still a pretty solid character. While I personally can't say I've used her all that much since I got Sunday, and especially since we all got RMC, she has still definitely got a relatively potent kit in comparison to the other standard characters that don't have too much going for them just yet. For one, her skills in action advance, which is huge on its own, but it also offers a pretty significant damage boost, and it cleanses too, which honestly thinking about it is kind of hilarious considering, like I said earlier, Bailu doesn't even have that. On top of that, her ult offers attack to the entire team and also buffs their crit damage. So on paper, her kit is pretty nuts actually, and really, if it weren't for 3 specific things, I'd say she's actually a really good character still. For one, her buffs are tied to ally turns rather than herself. So for example, if you use Bronya's skill on Saber, who has self-action advance whenever she hits max energy, she would instantly lose the damage buff from Bronya for her second attack and the subsequent ult that it provides. The ult does last 2 turns in comparison to the skill, which is definitely nice, but again, it does still tick down on each of the allies' turns, which is a little bit annoying, I can't lie. The second problem is that she has fierce competition with both Sunday and the RMC, like I said earlier, and lastly, her third problem is that similar to Sunday, she is a buffer and only a buffer, and more so, they're both not really designed for any specific team. Like, in the current state of HSR, pretty much every character released nowadays plays into some kind of gimmick, like Super Break, or they have a Memo Sprite, or even an Elation skill, and she doesn't really work with any of those teams because they each have their own characters, and those teams don't really need her. But, with all that said, even despite those problems, Bronya is still easily one of the better standard characters that the game has, and also definitely in the upper echelons of characters that I'd say you could pick, assuming you don't have anyone else that does what she does. As such, I would probably rate her on the pickability tier list at around an A, though I do want to drop her 1 tier down to B, because A, she's a standard character that you definitely should have in your 50-50 loss pool, and B, she has competition with the RMC who is completely free. She is definitely not a bad unit regardless though. And lastly, unfortunately for Bronya, unlike a character like Bailu, who I could see getting a buff at some point, and honestly some point relatively soon, due to the fact that Bronya is at least somewhat competitive with Sunday, who's, you know, a limited character, I don't really think she's going to be getting that buff anytime soon, so on that most likely to get buff tier list, I honestly don't think she can be really that high at all, so we'll put her down at a D. Moving on to Clara, honestly, I think this one's pretty simple. Clara is a character that fills a niche only held by one other character, and that's Yunli with the counter archetype. Basically, she gets hit, and then she attacks back. There are some bits of nuance where you can buff that counter attack with her ultimate, and playing around that is pretty important because that's where a pretty huge chunk of her damage comes from. I think the biggest thing for Clara is that she's in a specific niche, and in that niche, considering there's only one other character, it means she is in direct competition with them, and frankly, she is kinda just a worse version of Yunli. In a vacuum though, that isn't actually that bad, right? Like, there's no reason that a standard character should be as good as a limited one, so being worse isn't necessarily that big of a deal, but in this case it actually is, because not only is Clara a worse version of Yunli, but Yunli herself is struggling heavily in the current landscape of the game to get value because frankly, there's just not really that many places in the game that actually work well with counter-style gameplay. When we can say that Yunli needs a Nova Flare, yeah, it's pretty much wraps for Clara too. So this results in a pretty awkward situation for her. She's worse than a unit that also needs to get buffed, and the game itself doesn't really allow the gameplay niche she excels at to really, do anything, honestly. Hell, even the boss that's partially designed specifically for Clara and Yunli have such highly inflated HP at this point that it's a struggle to even clear with vertical investment into the entire team, let alone just Yunli or Clara. So with all that said, it is extremely difficult for me to recommend that anyone pick up Clara from their selector, so I feel like I kinda have to place her down in a D tier with Bailu. Maybe one day after Yunli gets a Nova Flare in the future, then Clara can get one too, but honestly, I really doubt it. So similar to Bronya, I don't think it's very likely that she's gonna get a buff anytime soon, so she'll be down in D tier for the most likely to get buff soon tier list as well. Now, we can talk about the GOAT from Belobog, Gepard. He was actually the unit that carried me pretty early on into the game because I didn't have Bailu to sustain back then, and the only other decent option at the time was Fu Zhuan. Honestly, his kit is even simpler than Clara's to be honest, because all he does is spam a skill to gain energy and then ult to give the team shields. There is some minor nuance where his skill can freeze the enemies, but considering half the things we fight nowadays can't even be frozen, I don't really count that as too much of anything. Considering that simplicity, there's really not a whole lot to talk about here. He's in direct competition with 2 other shielders that are still decent in the case of Aventurine and very strong in the case of Danhang PT, but he doesn't do anywhere close to enough to be on their same level. Alongside that, unlike at the beginning of the game game, where I generally say shields were king, nowadays there's a few decent healers too, with Lingsha being what I would consider fine, and then there's the monstrosity that's the Aeon of Veracity with Hyacine and Nika. So right now at least, I don't really think he's a character that anyone should be going for unless he's like literally your husband, and more so, I don't really think he's a character that should be in your 50-50 loss pool either. He is definitely pretty low on the tier list here, and honestly, I would put him down at an F. But similar to Bailu, there's usable and strong options in his niche, which in my opinion makes him a perfect candidate for getting a Nova Flare at some point to be at least, a little bit competitive with those two. Alongside that, there is actually a lot that they could do with him, from better shield uptime to playing into the old freeze part of his kit to adding some debuffs or whatever else, so if we're thinking towards the future, I would also probably put him around a B or so for the second tier list, as like I said, I can definitely see him getting buffed at some point. Moving on to our first damage dealer with Himeko, unironically, I would say she's actually one of the better units you could pick up, assuming that A, you don't have her, and B, you've also invested into Super Break. As a very brief rundown, every time an enemy gets broken, Himeko gets a stack for her counter, and once she gets 3 stacks, she does a follow-up. And considering she has that ability, this might seem crazy for those of you that either don't own Himeko or the Break Squad of Fugue and Dahlia, but Himeko is actually an extremely potent break DPS right now, as long as you have those other characters. Honestly, I would say she's actually on par with Rappa for general content and better than her in pure fiction, which is really solid in my opinion. Now, with that said, that does definitely pigeonhole her into that specific niche, but if she can clear content to a really respectable degree as a year 0 standard unit, then I think that's a great thing for her as a character. This is definitely anecdotal because, well, it's my personal opinion, but I also think that she's a hell of a lot of fun too, especially when you get that perfect setup where you do follow-up after follow-up after follow-up going one after the other, as she just keeps breaking enemy after enemy after enemy. So with all that said, again, assuming that you don't have her and you also do have break units, for example for your Firefly or something, Himeko is a really fun pickup in my opinion, and honestly I would therefore rate her around an A. But with that said, if you don't have any of the break supports, I would probably have to lower her down to a C, and even more so if you already have a copy of her. Her Eidolons really aren't anything special, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend picking up another copy, again, if you already have her. That said, she is still decent regardless. And with all of that said, because she is more than playable right now with the break team, I don't really see her getting a buff anytime soon unless Dwayne decides he wants his favorite to be strong. So in terms of future buffing potential, I would also say she's around a D. On to the first limited character, let's talk about Luocha. Luocha is kinda similar to Gepard in a sense, where Gepard's only role was to give the team shields, Luocha's only role is to, well, heal. But Luocha has passive healing that activates whenever you hit an enemy, and on top of that, instant burst healing every couple of turns that actually gives him a small niche with a few different characters. His kit is undoubtedly simple, but his raw healing numbers make him playable with remembrance units like Castoris as a budget option, and he's actually pretty solid in general with Maide. But both of those teams don't necessarily need him, which makes his overall usability not amazing, at least for now. He does actually have a buff strip on his ult as well, but for the most part I wouldn't say that has much value overall, at least in the current state of the game. He is definitely a healer through and through. Like, if you had a conversation with Luocha, it would probably go something along the lines of this. Hey, what do you do, man?
My skill, it heals. My ult, it triggers heals. My talent, it heals.
Right, so, anything else?
I heal.
So anyway, sort of similar to Bailu, if you don't have the current broken sustains like Hyacine or Dan Hang, then you honestly can't go terribly wrong if you pick him, though that's definitely with the caveat that you actually need him. With that said, I would probably put him at around a B. And with that said, given that he's a 1.x unit and also basically a blank slate in terms of the buffs that he could get, in my opinion there is a lot of potential there for him to get one, and more importantly, get one soon. So if you like planning ahead, I would honestly say I expect him to get a buff sometime in the near future, and you could put him up as high as an S there if you're okay with a bit of speculative planning. Sustains nowadays are generally super strong, so I don't really see him being much different whenever that buff happens, even more so because he's limited. And speaking of limited, now let's talk about the first limited support that the game ever got way back in 1.6 with Ruan Mei. To keep it short, she is a pretty big contender for a pick with your selector whether you don't have her at all, and honestly, even if you do. Basically, she's an extremely generic support that almost any team in the game can use, assuming you don't have the specific niche options that those teams may want. So, for example, if you don't have Cyrene or Tribby for your Casteris, well, Ruan Mei works. If you don't have Fugue for Break, Ruan Mei works there. If you don't have a third support for your Finon, Ruan Mei works there. She is usable pretty much everywhere because the buffs that she offers are ones that everyone likes, even if it's not exactly what they might need. If you add on top of that her broken E1 for those of us that already have her, I mean, yeah, it's pretty safe to say that she's a solid pickup. I mean, hell, despite having a bunch of other good supports in my account, and a few of them with Eidolons, I still find scenarios where she's useful. For example, in the Anomaly Arbitration for the current patch, I just split up my Remembrance Battleship into 2 teams, with Evernight on one with Cyrene, and Casteris on another with Hyacine. In the Casteris team, I ended up using Ruan Mei as one of the extra slots because the buffs that she provides are all ones that Casteris could use, even if it's not exactly what she wants. And honestly, without her, I'm not sure I would have been able to clear the 3 knights with 3 stars each. So really, what I'm saying is that if you don't have Ruan Mei, she's a pretty good pickup for your account, and even if you do, I would say it's worth considering her. As such, I would put her on the pickability tier list at around an S, but with that said, both because she's currently still usable and also extremely generic, I don't necessarily think there's a world where she's going to get buffed anytime soon. So for that tier list, she'll go down at around a D. Next, we can talk about Numby.
Dude, that's the wrong character.
Next, we can talk about the IRS.
That's not their name.
Next, we can talk about Ass.
Oh my god, bro.
Anyway, let's talk about Topaz. So, Topaz is actually someone that I've talked about fairly extensively back in an older video of mine, where I discussed the fact that she's not really in a great spot right now. She's a follow-up focused sub DPS that's entirely single target in a meta where follow-ups aren't that great right now, and on top of that, most content is AoE too. Outside of that, even if you're someone that wants to play follow-up teams regardless, she has very strong competition with Moose, who's a 4-star that most people have maxed out at this point, and also Hunt March, who's literally free. And what this results in is, well, she doesn't really have a place in the game at all, at least right now. So because of this, I don't really think I can recommend anyone actually picks her up with your selector, and instead, I think it would be much better to use it elsewhere, which would put her on a pickability tier list at a C. Like, she's not the worst character in the world, there are definitely worse options, but, you know, I can't really say she's great either. That said, because she's the limited 5-star and her competition are both 4-stars, I think there's a very real possibility that she gets buffed sometime soon, especially so because she already has a different kit in Currency Wars, for example. So, on the most likely to get buffed tier list, I would say she's easily an A. And now, we can talk about the actual GOAT, Welt. Sorry, Gepard. Welt has always been a really interesting character in that he has the potential to basically be anything. If you wanted a main DPS, he's got bounce attacks that would focus one enemy assuming it's single target. If you wanted a sub DPS, he has some okay AoE damage too, not to mention a few debuffs, and if you want a full support, I mean yeah, like I said, he's got the debuffs. Unfortunately, due to being a standard launch character, while he was definitely good for the early part of the game, the fact that he kinda did it all ended up hurting him in the long run in my opinion. Like, you can be decent at everything, but when you don't excel at anything, then you'll basically be the first thing to get replaced on a team. But with all that said, he is a character that's getting buffed and also the first standard character getting buffed, and from what we know so far, his buffs seem to be pretty damn good, especially so considering he is once again a standard unit. With his newer kit, it definitely seems like he's going to be more focused on that supportive role, and that gives him the spot that he can excel in. And alongside that, even now pre-buffs, his Eidolons aren't actually that bad, and post-buffs, they're going to be even better. So with that said, I think he's a character that people should definitely be considering picking up, even if you already have him. But I feel like I have to repeat this every time we talk about a standard character. You could just leave him in your 50-50 lost pool and I'm sure you'll get him eventually. Like for me, I'm pretty sure I'm up to E4 or something right now just from that, so while they can't give him full marks at an S tier or something, I'm definitely going to put him at A tier because I do think that after his buffs, he's going to be quite good for quite a while. And now onto the last one left that everyone is probably removed from their 50-50 pool by now, we've got Yanqing. He's a pretty cool one on paper. I mean, having a special state that gives huge buffs that you have to manage is in practice fairly unique and potentially even really fun gameplay. And I mean, honestly, after we all got Danheng PT, it's not really even that hard to manage anymore regardless. But his kit is absolutely old at this point, and with it comes the usual problems of lacking multipliers, outdated major traces, and all that kind of stuff. So, at least in the current state of the game, we've got a hypercarry DPS that's essentially tied at the hip with Danhang PT and also Sunday as his support, which obviously puts him in competition with the other hypercarry units that want the same thing. And I'm gonna be real, it's not really even a real competition because he is pretty severely outclassed. So with that said, he is definitely not someone that I can recommend right now. The game has countless DPS that you can choose from, and especially nowadays where everyone's got a gimmick they play into, someone like Yanqing just doesn't really have a place in the game, at least in my eyes. As such, I honestly wouldn't recommend anyone pick him up in general, and frankly, unless the future buff that he may get at some point somehow gives him that niche, I don't know if he's going to be really worth picking up then either. So for current use cases, I don't really think he's got much going for him at all, and I can't recommend anyone get him, so I'm going to put him down at F tier with his ice buddy Gepard. I do think he is going to get buffed at some point, but honestly, like I was just mentioning, his buff would somehow have to give him a niche for it to be even remotely impactful, so I don't necessarily think it's going to happen anytime soon, and I'll put him in C tier for that. And now, onto the speculative characters. If you've had your pulse on the HSR community recently, you've probably heard rumblings that both Huohuo and Robin might be getting added to the Stellar Convergence shop soon. Since at the time of recording this isn't confirmed, I don't want to go too hard into talking about them, but it is absolutely worth at least mentioning because they would definitely shake up the tier list at least a little bit. So, starting off with Huohuo, she's a sustain and she's also one of the characters that's getting buffed in 4.2. And honestly, I think even before the buff, she's still a decently useful character for people to have on their accounts. Like, is she some really giga-broken sustain that everyone needs, like Hyacine for example? I mean, no, definitely not, and I don't really expect that to change even after she gets her buffs. But, with that said, I would kind of place her in a similar ballpark to Luocha, where if you're missing a sustain slot, then she can definitely work. To be clear, unlike Luocha, her healing is definitely the weakest part of her kit, but that doesn't mean it makes her a brick. Just like with Ruan Mei earlier, I actually still use her to clear content in the current game, like for example in the Anomaly Arbitration where I use her as a sustain with my Evernight team. Was it optimal to do that? I mean, no, of course not, but it worked, and that was before she's even been buffed. So, in terms of how valuable she is as a pick on your selector, I'd say if Luocha got a B, then she would easily get an A, mostly because she is getting the buff, which would take her well beyond what he can offer. And Robin, on the other hand, I mean, I don't really think she needs much explanation, but if you don't know, she's got team-wide action advance, a damage buff, a large attack buff to the team, and even add some small damage sticks to ally attacks. And all of that stuff is undoubtedly useful, but as someone with E1 Robin on my account, within the last 6 months or so, I can only really tell you one time that I've actually used her, and that was with a sustainless DPS Irene comp or something if I'm remembering it right. Again, don't get me wrong, she is a great support, but with follow-up being in the dumps right now and that being her major niche, all that's left for most players is slotting her in as the extra unit when you don't have a full team, for example like Dot that doesn't have both Black Swan and Hyselins, or the gimmicky stuff like I just mentioned with my Cyrene comp. I really do think that she is a true victim of the niche problem that I've been talking about, where every team has their go-to support, and unfortunately for her, her go-to team is just really weak right now. But even despite that, I still think she is undoubtedly a useful character for every account in the game to have, and you really can't go wrong with getting just one copy at the very least. On top of that, she does scale pretty well with vertical investment, so going for an Eidolon isn't a bad idea either. Again, I mean, it's free. So in terms of whether or not you should pick her up, I would say yeah, because even though her team right now isn't the best, I don't really think that's her fault. If you don't have her, you should definitely consider going for her, and she gets an S there from me. Do I think she's gonna get buffed at some point? I mean, maybe. But honestly, I think the actual follow-up characters like Fei Zhao and Topaz need to buff a hell of a lot sooner than she does, so I don't think it's likely, and I'm going to put her down at a D there too. So yeah, I think that's about everyone, including the speculative characters, and if you were on the fence about picking a character, then hopefully I could give you a little bit of insight on who to choose. With all that said, I do want to be abundantly clear again, this is a gacha game. If you really like a character, then you should just go for that character and enjoy them, and if you don't like anyone, then just save your token. It's not like you have to spend it right now. At least personally at the time of recording, I haven't spent any of them myself, and it has been literally a year since we got the first one. But anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. I would love to hear your thoughts too, whether that's about who you're going for with your selector, or maybe who you'd like to be added to the shop next, so feel free to leave a comment down below, or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.